My name is Elena Patel, 36 years old. Standing in front of my mother's casket in a funeral home, reeking of formaldehyde in Ohio, I faced an enemy who did not wear a uniform. It was Richard, the man holding the title of my biological father. 20 years ago, he kicked me out of the house into the freezing rain because of a teenage pregnancy at 16. Today, he stood with his arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face in front of dozens of relatives staring right at me as he sneered, "Looks like life finally punished you. Where is your husband? Or did you fail all over again?" He was deliberately trying to back me into a corner, waiting for the poor, worthless daughter to break down. I looked him dead in the eye without a flinch. He had no idea that in exactly 3 minutes the heavy oak doors behind him were going to fly open, and the people walking through them would crush his sick 20-year ego into dust. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it right now, because I am about to prove to you there is no revenge more ruthless and perfect than absolute success. I remember the exact smell of that Tuesday night. Burnt drip coffee mingling with the sharp chemical sting of lemon pine sol. A completely ordinary, suffocating evening in an Ohio working-class suburb. Richard was anchored in his worn-out recliner, tilting his head as he flipped through the local newspaper. The dry, crisp rustle of paper. Helen, the woman I called mother, stood at the kitchen sink. Suds coated her hands up to the wrists. Water ran over dirty dinner plates. I stood dead center in the living room. 16 years old. My hands gripped the hem of my oversized wool sweater so hard my fingernails broke the skin of my palms. I felt the warm metallic sting of my own blood. My throat felt like it was packed with sawdust. I opened my mouth and forced out the words that would sever my life in half. I am pregnant. The running water at the sink stopped instantly. A wet porcelain plate slipped from Helen's hands. It shattered violently against the linoleum floor. Shards everywhere. Richard stopped flipping his paper. The silence that followed was suffocating. The ticking of the cheap wall clock suddenly magnified, hammering into my temples like a steel mallet. Tick, tick, tick. Richard slowly lowered the newspaper to his lap. There was no shock in his eyes. There was absolutely no trace of a father's disappointment or concern. Instead, the skin on his face tightened. His jaw locked into a rigid, cruel line. He looked at me, not as a terrified, trembling 16-year-old girl, but as a pile of garbage that had just been dumped right in the middle of his pristine living room. "Tell me you are joking." His voice was dangerously low. It hissed through his gritted teeth. I shook my head. A tiny, pathetic movement. Smash. His heavy, calloused hand slammed down onto the glass coffee table. The force was brutal. A half-empty glass of ice water jolted into the air, spilling over the edges. He shot up from the recliner. A thick, oil-stained finger pointed straight at my face, closing the distance between us. "You have disgraced this family." He spat the words out. "You rubbed dirt in my face in front of this entire damn neighborhood." He did not care about me. He did not care about the child inside me. He only cared about the whispers at the local hardware store, the judging eyes of the neighbors next door, his hollow, fragile blue-collar pride. Helen lunged forward. She grabbed his thick forearm, tears streaming down her face, begging him to stop. Richard did not even look at her. He violently shoved her away. Helen stumbled back, her spine slamming hard against the sharp edge of the kitchen counter. She whimpered, shrinking away into the shadows of the kitchen. Richard took another step, trapping me in the center of the room. The sour, stale stench of cheap tobacco rolled off his breath, suffocating me. "I am giving you two choices." He growled, his eyes bulging with rage. "Either you get rid of that trash in your belly, or you get the hell out of my house. Right now." I instinctively wrapped both arms around my stomach, a protective shield over a life that was barely the size of a fist. I took a step back. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me from the world. I shook my head again. That single act of defiance flipped a switch. The man turned into a rabid animal. He lunged, grabbing me by the upper arm. His grip bruised the bone. He yanked me forward, throwing me violently toward the bottom of the wooden staircase. "Pack your bags. If I see your face in 1 minute, I will personally throw you out onto the concrete. Midnight. The Ohio winter rain lashed sideways against the glass windows. The wind howled through the bare oak trees. I stepped out onto the concrete porch. I dragged a faded canvas duffel bag behind me. Inside were 3 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, and nothing else. Helen hovered by the doorway, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She reached out, trying to shove a crumpled $50 bill into my jacket pocket. Before the paper could even touch my coat, Richard's hand shot out. He snatched the cash right out of her fingers. He shoved Helen back inside. He gripped the brass handle of the front door, looking down at me with eyes devoid of any human warmth. Do not ever come back. The heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the freezing air. The deadbolt. A second later, the yellow porch light snapped off. Then the living room light went black. The entire house went dark, sealing itself off from me entirely. I stood alone under the pitch-black sky, 39 degrees. The freezing rain soaked right through my thin wool sweater, biting into my bare skin like thousands of icy needles. My teeth chattered violently. My wet clothes clung to my shivering frame. That night, shivering on the concrete, I learned my very first lesson in brutal survival. The most dangerous enemy you will ever face does not wait across a battlefield. They sleep down the hall. They eat at your dinner table. And they share your exact same last name. The freezing Ohio rain from that night bled straight into the next year of my life. There was no living, only holding on by my fingernails. I slept on a lumpy, urine-smelling couch at a women's shelter before scraping together enough cash for a studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. No radiator, no heat, just rattling window panes. I worked the graveyard shift at a highway diner off Interstate 71. The air inside always hung heavy with the smell of stale fryer grease and cheap industrial bleach. My job was scraping plates and scrubbing heavy cast iron skillets. The scalding dishwater and harsh chemicals stripped my skin raw. My knuckles cracked open and bled, leaving pink swirls in the soapy water. At 3 a.m., I would rush out the back door, lean against the freezing brick wall of the alley, and vomit from the morning sickness. The stench of the dumpsters burned my nose. Then I would wipe my mouth with the back of my bruised hand, haul 40-pound trash bags into the bin, and clock right back in. When Ethan was born, he was tiny. Barely 5.5 pounds. A frail little thing. I laid on a bare mattress on the floor, feeling his rapid bird-like heartbeat against my chest. I stared up at the water-stained ceiling and made a blood oath. He would never know what it felt like to be looked at with disgust. Back in the suburbs, Richard wiped my existence from his house. He sat in his worn recliner, drinking cheap domestic beer, watching Sunday football, and strictly forbade anyone from speaking my name. I was a ghost. But he could not control the United States Postal Service. I rented a cheap P.O. box. Every 2 months, a plain white envelope appeared. No return address. Inside, a ripped piece of notebook paper with just 2 words, "Love, Mom." Tucked inside the fold was a worn, crumpled $20 bill. Helen was skimming pennies from the grocery budget, hiding cash in her shoes to send to me. I knew the risk she took under that roof. That rough $20 bill bought powdered formula. It bought infant Tylenol when Ethan spiked a fever. It was a tactical supply line. The only thread of humanity keeping me from completely drowning in a world that had locked me out. It was a damp, foggy Tuesday morning when everything shifted. I was carrying Ethan in a cheap thrift store blanket, walking past a strip mall recruiting station. A female staff sergeant stood outside, sharp uniform, boots polished to a black mirror. She did not look at me with pity. Pity is useless to a starving mother. She took one look at my exhausted, hollowed-out face and asked a single slicing question. How long you plan on living like this? A week later, I signed the khaki contract. The United States Army did not care about a teenage pregnancy. They did not care about the sneers of an arrogant Ohio factory worker. They dealt in discipline and blood. In exchange for TRICARE health insurance and a roof over my son's head, I handed over my body. I shaved my hair. I strapped 40-pound rucksacks to my shoulders and ran miles under the blistering sun until my lungs tasted like copper. My boots chewed my heels into raw meat. I swallowed dirt instead of pride. Richard's rejection was a jet engine strapped to my back. Failure meant starving in an alley. I passed every physical test. I volunteered for the combat deployments no one else wanted. I threw myself into the sandbox, the suffocating 110-degree heat of the desert, the sharp, acrid smell of burnt cordite, the heavy metallic clack of a bolt seating a live round into an M4 rifle. Private to sergeant, sergeant to officer candidate school. I pinned on brass. The contrast was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. The biological father who shared my DNA threw me away like a broken tool to save face with his drinking buddies. But hardened, tattooed combat veterans, men and women from across the country, stood at rigid attention for me. They followed my orders without a second thought. They trusted me with their lives. If you have ever had to build your own life from absolute zero because the people who were supposed to love you walked away, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop the word survivor in the comments right now. Let me know I am not the only one who had to be their own hero. 20 years evaporated in a blur of camouflage and strategy. I stood on the edge of the parade deck at Fort Liberty. The hot sun beat down on the black asphalt. I kept my back perfectly straight, my hands clasped behind me. I watched Ethan, now a 20-year-old man, stand rigidly at attention in his crisp Class A uniform. A private in the United States Army. A direct slap in the face to the curse of the worthless mistake. I had won. The war for our survival was over. I had built a fortress of steel and discipline that Richard Patel could never breach. I turned on my heel, ready to walk back to my command office. Then my cell phone vibrated violently in the pocket of my uniform. I pulled it out. The screen lit up. The caller ID flashed an Ohio area code. The enemy was trying to make contact. 20 years to the exact month since that freezing rain. I sat in my command office at Fort Liberty. The air conditioning hummed a steady mechanical drone. 3 flat-screen monitors glowed in front of me, tracking logistics routes across 2 continents. Everything was in order, controlled, predictable. Then the personal cell phone on my heavy oak desk began to vibrate. The harsh buzzing rattled against the hard wood. I glanced down. An Ohio area code. The caller ID read Laura, my cousin. The family gossip who only called when someone was in financial trouble or dead. My tactical intuition flared. A deep, cold dread settled in my stomach. I picked up the phone. Hello? It was not Laura. It was Aunt Denise. Her breathing was exaggerated, wet and raspy, theatrical fake sobbing. Elena. She choked out, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. It is your mother. She had a massive heart attack this morning. She is gone. The entire world outside my office window stopped spinning. The humming of the air conditioning faded into pure static. I did not scream. I did not drop the phone. I clamped my jaw shut, sat perfectly straight in my leather chair, and locked my eyes onto the blank concrete wall across the room. My covert operative had fallen. I hung up the phone without saying another word. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. I slowly rolled my chair back. I reached down to the bottom drawer of my desk, grabbed the heavy metal handle, and pulled. Sitting alone in the dark corner of the drawer was a battered wooden ammunition box. I lifted it out and set it on the desk. It did not hold bullets. I popped the rusty brass latch. Inside sat stacks of faded envelope paper and dozens of worn $20 bills I had never spent. My hands, the same hands that had gripped a combat knife in hostile territory, were shaking. I brushed my thumb over the slanted, hurried handwriting on the top note. Love, Mom. There would never be another unmarked envelope in my mailbox. That realization ripped straight through the invisible armor I'd worn for 2 decades. Helen was the only anchor I had left to the Patel name. She was the woman who skimmed grocery money to keep my son alive when her husband threw us to the wolves. And now she was gone. The tactical supply line was permanently cut. I was completely alone on this front. 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Laura. Her voice lacked any real grief. It was bright, sharp, and polished to a sickening shine. She rattled off the schedule for the Friday afternoon viewing at the local funeral home. I listened, my face set in stone. Right before she hung up, she dropped the psychological bait. "Your dad was asking." Laura paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to let the poison drip. "He wants to know if you would even dare to show your face." My lip curled into a slow, cold smirk. 20 years of dead silence. 20 years of pretending I did not exist. And now Richard was using his wife's fresh grave to probe enemy lines. He wanted to test the waters. In his narrow, arrogant mind, he probably pictured me as that same terrified 16-year-old girl shivering on the concrete porch, too ashamed to look him in the eye. He wanted to see if I was still broken. He needed to see me broken to validate his own cruelty. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I kept my voice flat, icy, and completely devoid of emotion. "Tell him I will be there." I ended the call. That was not a promise to attend a funeral. It was a declaration of war. Friday afternoon. The Ohio sky was the same suffocating bruised gray it had been 20 years ago. My black V8 sport utility vehicle crushed the loose rocks beneath its tires as I rolled into the gravel parking lot of the town funeral home. I eased the heavy machine into a spot near the back and shifted into park. I killed the engine. The low, aggressive rumble died instantly. I sat in the heavy silence of the cabin. I looked into the rearview mirror. I ran a hand over the lapel of my tailored black suit. I did not wear my military uniform. I did not need rows of brass medals or silver eagles on my shoulders to prove my worth to a room full of cowards. The uniform was for my country. This suit was for an execution. I pushed the heavy car door open. The damp air hit me immediately. The thick, sickening smell of fresh, hot asphalt mixed with the overwhelming stench of funeral lilies. It coated the back of my throat. I slammed the rusted car door shut behind me. I squared my shoulders. My posture was rigid. I adjusted my stride, moving with the measured, predatory calmness of a soldier walking into a known ambush. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy double-glass doors at the front of the brick building. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I was crossing the final defensive line. Behind those doors was not a grieving family. It was a psychological minefield, carefully rigged by the man who held the title of my biological father. I reached out. I gripped the cold brass handle. I pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. The heavy double-glass doors sealed shut behind me. The dull roar of the Ohio highway traffic vanished instantly, replaced by the thick, suffocating air of the parlor. It smelled like industrial formaldehyde, masked by the sickeningly sweet scent of dying orchids. Aunt Denise was on me before I took 3 steps. She threw her arms around my shoulders. A theatrical hollow embrace meant entirely for the audience in the room. She reeked of cheap floral perfume and stale cigarette smoke. As she pulled back, her eyes immediately darted up and down my body, a rapid, calculating scan. She was hunting for designer labels, diamond earrings, a Rolex. Anything that screamed money. I wore a tailored black suit, sharp, clean, but entirely unbranded. No jewelry, not even a watch. I saw a quick flash of disappointment in her eyes, immediately followed by a smug, satisfying gleam. She had her answer. In her mind, the plain suit meant I was still at the bottom of the barrel. I stepped past her. The room was packed with people who shared my bloodline. The crowd parted like oil-repelling water. A few gave stiff, obligatory nods. Most just stared at the ugly floral carpet, refusing to make eye contact. The second my back was turned, the buzzing started. Low grating whispers vibrating like a hive of angry wasps under the sickly yellow lighting. I did not need to read lips to know what they were saying. To this room, I was not a commanding officer in the United States Army. I was not a woman who held the lives of thousands of soldiers in her hands. I was still the 16-year-old mistake. The pregnant trash Richard threw out into the freezing rain. Time had stopped for them 20 years ago. My tactical vision ignored the static. I swept the room and locked onto the primary target, Richard. He stood near the front, right beside the polished wood casket. He was 20 years older. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his hair had thinned into a gray patch, but that arrogant, rigid jawline remained completely unchanged. He was surrounded by the same blue-collar neighborhood guys he drank beer with on Sundays, soaking in their hollow condolences. He lifted his head, his eyes cut through the crowd and slammed right into mine. The air in the room froze. We stared at each other across 40 feet of cheap carpet. I did not blink. I kept my breathing steady. I waited for a nod, a flicker of recognition, anything that resembled a human father. Instead, the corners of his mouth tightened into a hard, cruel line. He deliberately turned his back to me and reached out to shake a neighbor's hand. A total calculated diplomatic cutoff. An active dismissal. I did not react. I kept my spine perfectly straight and walked directly to the casket. My dress shoes made no sound on the floor. I looked down. Helen looked incredibly small. Her pale hands were folded over her chest. The funeral makeup artist had tried to give her color, but she just looked exhausted. A dry, painful lump formed in my throat. I swallowed it down. I leaned in close to the cold satin interior. "I hope you knew," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the humming air conditioning. "Every crumpled $20 bill you sent became the ammunition I needed to survive. I did not waste a single cent." A heavy hand patted my shoulder. "Aunt Denise again." She gestured toward a narrow hallway with a sharp jerk of her chin. "Come here. There is something your mother wanted you to have." I followed her into a cramped back office. It smelled like old paper and dust. Stacked in the corner were 3 heavy cardboard boxes. Denise pointed at them, her face sour and annoyed. "She made me promise to hand these directly to you. Do not make a mess." She turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the cramped space. I crouched down. I pulled the brown packing tape off the top box. I expected to find old sweaters, maybe faded photo albums from when I was a kid. I was wrong. I stared down into a carefully organized intelligence cache. Hundreds of local newspaper clippings, printouts of military promotions from public army databases, a grainy blown-up photo of me pinning on my Silver Eagle rank. Helen had never been cut off from my life. While Richard spent 2 decades trying to erase my existence, my mother had built a covert surveillance network. She tracked every single move I made, every rank, every deployment, every victory. She kept it all hidden in the dark right under his nose inside these cardboard boxes. Resting on top of a stack of commendation papers was a white sealed envelope. My name was written in her shaky slanted handwriting. I tore the flap open. I pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was not a tearful, sad goodbye. It was a razor-sharp psychological profile of the enemy. "Elena," the letter began. "Pride is a terrible thing to abandon, especially for a man who believes being right is more important than being loved. Richard thinks he has been punishing you all these years. The truth is, he just chopped off his own limbs and wonders why he is bleeding. He's terrified of you because you survived without him." The final line of the letter was not a mother's dying wish. It was a direct tactical order from my underground ally. "When the truth comes out today, use grace to break his anger." I read the line twice. I folded the lined paper into a tight, perfect square. I slid it deep into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, placing it right over my heart. The armor was fully reinforced. I turned around and walked out of the cramped office. The sickly yellow light of the main hall washed over me again. The murmuring crowd had gone completely silent. The space around the casket was empty. I looked up. Richard had detached himself from his circle of friends. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his dark slacks. His jaw was clenched so hard the muscle twitched under his skin. He was walking slowly, deliberately straight toward me. The attack was about to begin. Richard closed the distance. His heavy work boots thumped against the thick funeral parlor carpet. He stopped exactly 18 inches in front of me. A deliberate, aggressive invasion of my personal space. The low buzzing of the crowd instantly died. Pin-drop silence. The relatives holding plastic cups of iced water stopped drinking. Their ears pricked up like radar dishes. They could smell the blood in the water. They knew a collision was coming, and they wanted a front-row seat to the carnage. Richard crossed his thick arms over his chest. He slowly dragged his eyes up and down my unbranded black suit. The corners of his mouth twitched, then pulled back into a sick, satisfied smirk. It looks like life finally caught up with you. His voice carried. It was loud enough for the first 3 rows of folding chairs to hear perfectly. I did not take a single step back. I stood my ground. I locked my knees and kept my breathing regulated to exactly 15 breaths per minute. A sniper resting heart rate. I looked at him not as a father, but as a hostile target exposing his own position. My absolute silence acted like gasoline on his temper. He wanted me to cower. He needed me to cry. When I did, neither his jaw hardened. You brought this on yourself. He fired his second shot. The blue-collar Ohio gravel in his throat was rough and grating. You dragged this family through the mud when you were 16. You smashed your own future to pieces with your bare hands. He glanced over his shoulder. He scanned the room, gathering approving nods from his old drinking buddies standing by the floral arrangements. He turned back to me, emboldened by his pack. And look at you now. Look at this. You are standing here today, completely alone. You have absolutely nothing to your name. My wife enabled you for far too long, and this is how you repay her. By showing up here looking like a nobody and embarrassing me all over again. His pathetic, fragile logic laid itself bare on the carpet. He saw a plain suit. He saw no flashy jewelry. He saw me standing without a man holding my hand. His narrow, arrogant mind immediately calculated the sum. He was right. I was a failure. The trash he threw out into the freezing rain had remained trash. You do not know anything about me, I replied. My voice was flat. The volume was low, just loud enough for him to hear, but the tone was as sharp as a surgical scalpel. Richard let out a harsh, ugly scoff. A burst of stale air, smelling heavily of black coffee and cheap mints, hit my face. He took another half step forward, crowding me. I know exactly what you are, he spat, his face flushing dark red. Where is your husband, huh? Who the hell would ever want to keep a piece of garbage like you? He was desperately clinging to a script he had written 20 years ago. He needed to be the righteous judge. He needed me to be the guilty criminal. For a fraction of a second, a sharp spike of pain pierced through my chest. It was a vicious psychological hit. I had bled in the desert sand. I had earned the salutes of thousands of combat-hardened soldiers. I carried the weight of national security on my shoulders. Yet the man who shared my DNA was standing over my mother's casket, practically begging to drink my blood. He was using the death of the woman who birthed me to prove a point to his neighbors. But then I felt the weight of the folded notebook paper resting in the inside pocket of my jacket. Helen's final intelligence report. He is terrified of you because you survived without him. Richard was not attacking me. He was violently defending his own massive insecurities. If I was successful, it meant his cruelty was completely unjustified. He needed me to be a broken victim so he could sleep at night. You still think you are something special, do you not? He snarled. A tiny fleck of spit flew from his lip and landed on my lapel. You have nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I remembered the order from my underground ally. Use grace to break his anger. Instead of reacting to his rage, I smiled. It was a quiet, freezing smile. It held absolutely no warmth. It was the smile of a commanding officer holding a royal flush against a man betting his life on a pair of twos. I let my arms hang loose at my sides. No, Dad. I answered, dropping the word like a heavy stone. Actually, I'm just waiting here to introduce you to someone. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly between us. I watched the confusion flicker behind his angry eyes. My husband. The exact second the final syllable left my lips, the air outside the building shifted. A massive heavy-duty diesel engine roared to life in the gravel parking lot. The deep, guttural vibration rattled the thin window panes of the funeral home. Blinding white LED headlights slashed through the frosted glass of the double front doors. Sharp, elongated shadows of several men stretched violently across the ugly floral carpet, pointing straight at Richard's boots. The heavy double-glass doors at the front of the parlor were violently shoved apart. They hit the rubber wall stops with a sharp, echoing crack. A sudden gust of freezing Ohio wind ripped into the suffocating room, carrying the bitter scent of wet asphalt and decaying autumn leaves. It cut straight through the stale stench of formaldehyde. Every single grating whisper in the room died instantly. The air turned into solid concrete. 6 men strode through the doorway. They were not wearing cheap, ill-fitting dark suits like the rest of the men in this town. They wore immaculate pressed United States Army Class A dress uniforms. The sharp rhythmic clack-clack-clack of their hard leather dress shoes striking the linoleum floor sent a visible shiver through the crowd. Leading the formation was a man with a broad chest, a rigid spine, and eyes like a hawk. Pinned to the dark fabric of his shoulders were 3 silver stars catching the sickly yellow light of the parlor. Lieutenant General David Walker. My husband. The crowd of relatives and neighborhood gossips physically parted. They shrank back into the folding chairs, flattening themselves against the floral wallpaper like a school of fish dodging a shark. No one dared to breathe loudly. I kept my eyes locked on Richard. The arrogant, satisfied smirk that had been plastered across his face just 3 seconds ago completely melted. It vanished like it had been wiped off with a dirty rag. David ignored the room. He swept his cold gaze past the gaping mouths of my aunts and uncles, finding me standing near the casket. The hardened military exterior softened for a fraction of a second. He closed the distance, reached out, and pulled me into his solid chest. A massive, impenetrable shield. "I am sorry I am late," he said. His voice was low, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried to the back walls. Traffic off the base was backed up. He let me go, turning his head slowly to look at the man standing 18 inches away. I took a half step back. I looked at the man who had thrown me into the freezing rain 20 years ago. I kept my voice entirely flat. I read the sentence like a judge reading a final verdict. "Dad, this is my husband, General David Walker." Richard's face drained of all color. He went pale, taking on the gray ashen hue of wet cement. The heavy muscle in his jaw went slack, dropping his mouth open in an ugly, terrified gape. David extended his large, calloused right hand, a perfectly professional, icy gesture. "Hello, Richard." The silence stretched. 1 second, 3 seconds, 5. The blue-collar conservative men in this room practically worshipped military authority. It was their ultimate measure of a man. And right now, a 3-star general was demanding respect from a retired factory worker who had just been caught verbally abusing his wife. It took 10 agonizing seconds for Richard to move. He nervously wiped his thick, sweaty palm against the side of his cheap slacks. His hand was visibly trembling as he reached out and took David's hand. The handshake was weak, defeated. But that was not the kill shot. A younger officer, a captain wearing a ranger tab on his shoulder, stepped out of the formation. He walked directly toward me, completely ignoring Richard. He stopped, sharply squared his broad shoulders, and snapped a razor-sharp salute. The loud smack of his leather heels coming together cracked through the silent room like a rifle shot. "Colonel Patel," the captain's voice was a booming bark of absolute respect. "We are deeply sorry for your loss, ma'am." He dropped his hand. The officer behind him stepped up. Smack! Another salute. "Colonel Patel, my condolences." Then the next, and the next. 5 highly trained combat officers stepped forward, saluted, and loudly repeated that exact title. "Colonel Patel, Colonel Patel." Each sharp syllable acted like a heavy sledgehammer, swinging back and smashing directly into Richard's eardrums. He flinched with every single salute. His eyes were wide, bulging, and rapidly filling with bloodshot red lines. The psychological airstrike was complete. The ground beneath him had just collapsed. This moment was not about my husband's rank. It was not about hiding behind a powerful man. It was about me. The pregnant 16-year-old garbage he threw onto the porch. The mistake. The failure. I was standing directly in front of him as a full-bird colonel in the United States Army. I did not ride David's coattails. I commanded these officers with my own blood, sweat, and tactical expertise. They answered to me. I glanced past Richard. Aunt Denise had both hands clamped over her mouth. The rest of the relatives were biting their lips, their eyes wide with sheer terror, desperately avoiding my gaze. They realized how terribly they had miscalculated. If you have ever had the ultimate satisfaction of proving your toxic family wrong without saying a single angry word, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Drop the word karma in the comments. Let me know I am not the only one who lets success do the talking. Everything Richard had stubbornly believed for 2 decades was annihilated in less than 60 seconds. He had spent 20 years guarding a hollow fake narrative. While he drank cheap beer and cursed my name, I had crawled through the dirt, picked up the broken pieces of my life, and forged them into a fortress of steel. His arrogant gun was jammed. He was completely out of ammunition. Richard stumbled backward, his heavy boots dragged across the carpet. His knees suddenly buckled, giving out under his own weight. He fell back, his hips slamming hard against the edge of the wooden table, holding the guest book. He gripped the edge of the wood with white knuckles, fighting for air. He stared at me, his chest heaving, realizing that his actual punishment was just beginning. The heavy work boots that kicked me out 20 years ago suddenly lost all their structural integrity. Richard stumbled backward, his heavy heels dragged across the ugly floral carpet. He backed up blindly, his hip colliding hard with the edge of the wooden guestbook stand. The thick, leather-bound book slid across the polished surface, stopping just an inch from crashing to the floor. His knees buckled. He dropped like a sack of concrete into a cheap red velvet folding chair. The metal frame groaned loudly under his weight. The arrogant, puffed-up Ohio factory worker evaporated. The man who had sneered at me 5 minutes ago was completely gone. What was left in that chair was just an old, shriveled man, a deflated balloon. The parlor was dead silent. The aunts and uncles who had been buzzing like angry wasps moments ago were now intensely studying the toes of their shoes. Aunt Denise kept her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide, refusing to look in my direction. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to utter a single syllable to defend him. They were cowards through and through. I stood exactly where I was, my posture perfectly rigid. Behind me, the 6 combat officers instinctively shifted their leather boots, creaking softly. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of olive drab and brass. They blocked every possible exit. Richard was trapped. He looked up. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. His chest heaved up and down. A wet, wheezing gasp rattled in the back of his throat. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. When he finally spoke, the booming, authoritative bark he used to terrorize his household was completely gone. His voice was cracked, thin, and pathetic. You never told anybody. It was a desperate, scrambling attempt to salvage a single shred of dignity. Blame the victim. Play the fool. If I had just told him I was an officer, he would have acted differently. That was the lie he was trying to spin to save face in front of the room. I looked down at the thinning gray hair on the top of his head. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing. Tell who Aunt Denise so she could spread the gossip around the local hair salon. Tell the guys at the hardware store in this dying Rust Belt town I had spent the last 2 decades surviving in the dirt, carrying 40-pound rucksacks and bleeding in the desert. I did not owe this town a damn thing. I squared my shoulders. I looked down at him, my voice completely stripped of emotion. It was ice cold. A commanding officer has no obligation to submit an after-action report to a deserter. Why, that sentence severed the very last invisible thread between us. It stripped him of his title. It revoked his clearance. He was no longer my father. He was just a man who walked off the battlefield 20 years ago when the fight got hard. He was completely outside my chain of command. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his wrinkled neck. He was bleeding out psychologically, and he knew it. He had no counterattack. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored black suit jacket. My fingers brushed the smooth, folded paper. I pulled out the sealed white envelope Helen had left behind in the cardboard box. I stepped forward, closing the distance, and dropped it directly onto his lap. Mom's final play. Richard stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade resting on his thighs. His thick, calloused fingers were violently shaking as he slowly picked it up. He fumbled with the flap, his dirty thumbnail tearing jaggedly through the paper. He pulled out the lined notebook sheet. The room watched him read. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the slanted handwriting of the wife he had silenced and bullied for decades. His eyes snagged on the middle paragraph. He thinks he has been punishing you. The truth is, he just chopped off his own limbs. I could see the exact second the words registered in his brain. His breathing hitched. Then came the final psychological kill shot from the grave. Every birthday he missed was his loss, not yours. He's terrified because you survived without him. Helen's silent, unsaid words acted like a rusted blade carving out the toxic infection in his brain. It was a flawless strike from a dead woman. Richard could argue with me. He could yell at his neighbors. He could punch a hole in the drywall. But he could not gaslight a ghost. The silence stretched. The only sound was the harsh hum of the air conditioning unit mounted in the ceiling. Then it happened. A single drop of water welled up in the corner of his wrinkled, bloodshot eye. It spilled over the edge, tracking slowly down the deep grooves of his weathered cheek, and splashed directly onto the lined paper, blurring the blue ink. Then a second drop. In 36 years of living, I had never seen this man shed a tear. Not when his parents died. Not when the local plant laid off half the town. Not when he threw his pregnant teenage daughter onto the freezing concrete. The iron-clad conservative armor cracked and shattered into a million pieces right there on the red velvet chair. He had burned 20 years of his life, 20 years of memories, and his only child just to protect a hollow, fragile ego. And now, at 60 years old, staring across the room at his wife's casket, he realized he had absolutely nothing to show for it. No family, no respect. Just an empty house. Richard slowly lowered the piece of paper. His hand rested on his knee, trembling uncontrollably. He looked up at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, swimming in a desperate, suffocating panic. The arrogance was dead. His jaw quivered. He forced out a late, useless confession. I thought I was teaching you a lesson. I did not gloat. A commanding officer does not laugh over the body of a defeated enemy. I stood perfectly still, my hands hanging loosely by my sides, watching that single drop of salt water roll down Richard's weathered cheek. The air in the funeral parlor felt completely drained, vacuumed out by his sudden psychological collapse. Aunt Denise and the rest of the Ohio relatives remained frozen in their cheap folding chairs. Their mouths hung slightly parted. They were holding their breath, waiting for me to scream. They were waiting for a massive dramatic blow-up, the kind of trashy screaming match this neighborhood thrived on. That was not going to happen. I operated with precision. "You taught me a massive lesson, Dad," I said. My tone was steady, even, devoid of any lingering childhood anger. I turned my head slightly, looking past his slumped shoulder to David and the 5 combat officers standing behind me. They formed a rigid wall of olive drab brass and hardened discipline. They were men who had actually bled for me. Then I snapped my eyes back to Richard's bloodshot gaze. "You taught me that family is not defined by who shares a last name." I let the words hang in the heavy floral-scented air for a second. "It is defined by who decides to stay when the storm hits." Every relative standing near the casket swallowed hard. Some shifted their weight, their cheap dress shoes scraping against the floor. With 2 sentences, I completely stripped them of their bloodline privileges. They thought sharing DNA meant they were automatically owed my respect. They were dead wrong. I owed them absolutely nothing, because not a single one of them had ever offered me their loyalty when I was starving. They had traded my survival away for cheap town gossip. David stepped up beside me. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on the small of my back. It was a silent, protective gesture from a man who actually knew what it meant to lead and protect. A physical signal that the objective was secure. The perimeter was held. It was time to pull out. I gave a slight nod. We turned our backs to the casket, the whispering crowd and the broken man sitting in the red velvet chair. My black dress shoes pivoted toward the heavy glass doors at the front of the parlor. We took 2 steps. "Elena." The voice came from behind me. It was a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. It sounded exactly like a stray dog begging at a rusted screen door. I stopped walking. I did not turn my head. Behind me, Richard was curled inward, clutching Helen's folded notebook paper against his chest like a bulletproof vest. He choked on his own uneven breath, fighting the sudden lack of oxygen in his lungs. Then he forced out 3 words that I had desperately craved to hear 20 years ago. I was wrong. Those 3 words carried 1,000 pounds of weight. If he had said them while I was scraping burning grease off diner plates, or while I was throwing up in a freezing alley behind the dumpsters, they might have saved us. But they were 20 years too late. Their expiration date had passed the exact second that heavy deadbolt clicked shut in the freezing rain. They meant absolutely nothing to me now. They were just empty syllables falling onto a cheap carpet. I slowly turned around. I walked back toward the folding chair, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The room held its collective breath again. There was no sudden burst of rage. I did not point a finger in his face or demand an apology. I executed the final, most brutal form of grace. I leaned down over him. The smell of his stale black coffee and cheap mints hit my nose again, mixing with the scent of his nervous sweat. I pressed my lips against his cheek. His skin was freezing cold and slick with clammy moisture. It was not a kiss of reunion. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, and it certainly was not an olive branch. It was the physical closing of a casket. The absolute burial of a relationship that had died on a concrete porch 2 decades ago. I pulled back, keeping my face inches from his, and looked directly into his terrified eyes. "Hold on to that letter, Dad," I whispered. "It is the only thing you have left." I stood up straight. With that single icy gesture, I proved my absolute superiority. I had beaten him in power, I had beaten him in dignity, and I had beaten him in mercy. I did not even have the energy to hate him anymore. Hate required an emotional investment I was no longer willing to spend. Richard Patel was no longer qualified to be my opponent. He was just a ghost, haunting his own empty life. I turned on my heel. I hooked my arm firmly through David's. The 5 military officers instantly parted, creating a wide, clear path to the exit. They fell into step right behind us. Their heavy leather boots hit the floor in perfect rhythmic synchronization. The sound drowned out the nervous whispering of the Ohio relatives. I reached the front of the parlor and pushed the heavy glass double doors open with my free hand. The cold Ohio night wind slapped me in the face immediately. It howled fiercely through the gravel parking lot, carrying the first heavy stinging drops of a coming winter storm. The temperature plummeted and the wind bit into my suit jacket. It felt exactly like the night I was dragged by my arm and thrown out into the dark to freeze. Except this time I was not shivering. I was not a terrified 16-year-old girl begging for a warm bed. I was walking out with a fully armed, fiercely loyal battalion behind me, the family I had chosen. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind us. They snapped together with a sharp, heavy thud, instantly slicing off the sound of Richard's pathetic, ragged sobbing. I had won the hardest war of my life, and I never had to fire a single bullet. The heavy tires of the black sport utility vehicle crushed the loose gravel as David steered us out of the funeral home parking lot. I sat in the passenger seat, letting my head rest heavily against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the bruised Ohio sky opened up completely. Freezing rain lashed against the windshield in violent rhythmic sheets. The yellow halos of the cheap streetlights flashed by, casting long moving shadows across the dashboard. Inside the cabin, the space shrank down to just the 2 of us. The interior glowed with a faint, steady blue light from the instrument panel. The heater hummed a low mechanical drone, pushing warm air against my freezing ankles. The smell of rich, aged leather from the seats finally overpowered the lingering, sickening stench of formaldehyde and dying orchids that had been stuck in my sinuses for the last hour. Then the psychological crash hit me. It was not a sudden wave of triumphant adrenaline. There were no victory trumpets sounding off in the back of my mind. I did not feel an overwhelming rush of joy or vindication. Instead, a crushing, paralyzing exhaustion dropped squarely onto my chest. My bones felt like solid lead pipes. Every tight, coiled muscle in my back, my neck, and my shoulders released all at once, leaving me feeling completely hollowed out. This is the brutal reality of cutting out a toxic infection. You spend 20 years bracing for an impact, 20 years fighting a ghost in your own mind. And when you finally put a bullet in it, you just feel empty. The desperate, pathetic craving for a father's validation, a tumor I had carried in my chest since I was 16 years old, had just been surgically removed without anesthesia. The incision was deep. It ached. But the rotting tissue was permanently gone. The wound was finally clean. David kept his left hand steady on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed purely on the dark, slick asphalt ahead. He did not turn to look at me. He did not offer a soft, pitying sigh, and he absolutely did not ask, "Are you okay?" He was a combat veteran. He knew damn well that question was worse than useless in the immediate aftermath of a firefight. Instead, he reached across the wide center console with his right hand. He found my hand resting limply on my lap. He wrapped his thick fingers around mine and squeezed hard. His skin was rough, covered in thick, permanent calluses from decades of gripping standard-issue rifles and heavy steering columns. He did not say a single word. He just slowly ran his rough thumb back and forth across my knuckles. That quiet, grounding physical contact anchored me to the leather seat. It was worth 1,000 cheap, manufactured apologies. I turned my head slightly to look at his profile, illuminated by the passing headlights. 3 silver stars gleamed on his dark uniform shoulders, yet he never once tried to eclipse me in that parlor. He used his immense, overwhelming authority not to overshadow my presence, but to act as a reinforced concrete launchpad for my own firepower. He was the family I chose, the kind of absolute loyalty that did not require matching DNA. I pulled my posture straight, rolling my shoulders back to shake off the remaining numbness. I unclasped my black leather purse and pulled out my cell phone. The screen lit up the dark cabin. 3 missed calls, all from Laura. The Ohio relatives were probably panicking right now, pacing holes into that ugly floral carpet, completely losing their minds over what had just happened. Let them panic. Let them chew on the bitter reality of their own irrelevance. I ignored the notifications and opened my contacts list. I scrolled down the alphabetical index, past my unit commanders, past the base logistics officers. My thumb stopped hovering over the letter R, Richard Patel. I stared at the name glowing on the harsh white screen. For a fraction of a second, my thumb hesitated, a microscopic pause. 20 years of deeply ingrained biological conditioning tried to fight back. A tiny, irrational whisper from a terrified 16-year-old girl standing in the freezing rain begged me to keep the line open, just in case. I shut the whisper down completely. I swiped left. The red delete box appeared. I tapped it. A confirmation prompt popped up on the glass. I tapped block contact. Done. The digital execution took less than 2 seconds, but it cost me 2 decades of blood, sweat, and combat boots to earn the right to do it. From this exact second forward, that Ohio area code was permanently wiped from my communication grid. They could scream into the void all they wanted. My radio was off. I tossed the cell phone into the dark glove box, slammed it shut with a sharp crack, and closed my eyes. The SUV tires hit the smooth, grooved concrete of the Interstate 71 on-ramp. The heavy diesel engine roared, shifting gears as we picked up speed on the wet asphalt. A mile down the highway, the bright overhead lights of a state toll booth cut through the heavy rain. David slowed the vehicle, rolling down the window, just enough to scan the electronic toll pass. A sharp, mechanical beep rang out. The red light on the electronic sign instantly flipped to a bright, glowing green. The heavy striped barrier arm lifted into the stormy sky, opening the lane. We accelerated through. Behind me, miles back in the dark, Richard Patel was left entirely alone to face the total blackout of his remaining years. He was going to spend the rest of his life rotting inside a suffocating empty house without Helen. There would be no holiday visits, no grandchildren running across his lawn, no legacy. He was locked inside a psychological prison he had built with his own 2 hands, clutching a piece of notebook paper from a dead woman. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on the road. The black SUV tore through the driving rain, crossing the state line, accelerating hard into the dark. The extraction was successful. Now we were heading toward the dawn. 6 months later, the blistering morning sun baked the dry, sandy training grounds of Fort Liberty. I stood alone on the 2nd-story metal catwalk outside my command office. Both hands were wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. The bitter steam curled up into the dry, arid air. The sky above me was massive, stretching out in a brilliant, unbroken blue from horizon to horizon. There was absolutely no trace of the suffocating, bruised gray clouds that constantly hung over that dying Ohio steel town. Down below, the rhythmic, heavy sound of combat boots striking the black asphalt echoed across the compound. A platoon was running morning physical training. The dust kicked up around their ankles in a low cloud. At the front of the formation, calling out the heavy cadence, was Ethan. His voice boomed over the training yard, sharp and clear. Left, right, left. He was 20 years old. His olive drab green t-shirt was soaked dark with sweat clinging to the thick, corded muscle of his shoulders and back. He pushed his squad harder, leading entirely by example, never faltering, never looking back. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, watching him run. Richard Patel had looked at my flat stomach 20 years ago and called this boy a mistake. He called him a piece of garbage, a permanent disgrace to a hollow working-class family name. But looking down at the disciplined, fiercely loyal young man leading American soldiers in the dirt, I knew the absolute truth. I had taken the heavy, rusted iron chain of generational abuse, and I had snapped it completely in half. There would be no gaslighting in my bloodline. There would be no screaming over spilled glasses of water. No throwing terrified pregnant kids out into the freezing winter rain to save face with the neighbors. I had systematically replaced the toxic cycle of my father with iron discipline and unconditional love. I turned away from the metal railing and stepped back inside my air-conditioned office. My heavy wooden desk was covered in classified logistics folders, regional deployment schedules, and tactical maps. But sitting right at the top corner in plain sight was the battered wooden ammunition box. For 2 decades, I'd kept it buried in the bottom drawer, hidden away like a shameful, bleeding secret. Not anymore. I had taken the crumpled, faded $20 bills and the lined notebook paper, Helen's final psychological profile of the enemy, and placed them securely inside a heavy black wooden frame. The glass frame now sat dead center on my desk, right next to my brass command coins. It was no longer a painful reminder of a life I was violently excluded from. It was a permanent monument to a covert intelligence network. My mother never wore a camouflage uniform. She never pinned on rank or fired an M4 rifle. She lived her entire adult life trapped behind enemy lines in a toxic, suffocating house. But she was the absolute hero of my personal war. She smuggled the tactical supplies that kept me alive when I was starving in an alley. 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled the solid oak door of my office. "Come in," I commanded. The heavy door swung open. A young army captain stepped perfectly over the threshold. He squared his broad shoulders, stood at rigid attention, and snapped a crisp textbook salute. The sharp clack of his leather heels echoed off the concrete walls. "Colonel, the regional strategy briefing is ready for you in the war room." "I am on my way, Captain. Thank you." He dropped his hand, executed a flawless about-face, and marched back down the long hallway. I set my coffee mug down on the desk next to Helen's framed letter. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my uniform. My thumb brushed against the solid silver eagle pinned securely to my shoulder. It was just a small piece of cold, lifeless metal, but it carried the staggering weight of 20 years of brutal survival. It was forged in the freezing Ohio rain, hammered out in the sweltering 110-degree heat of the desert sands, and cooled in the blood and sweat of a woman who simply refused to lay down and die. I turned and walked toward the open door. I was stepping out to face massive global military operations. But for the very first time in my entire life, I was walking completely light. The heavy, suffocating ghost of Richard Patel was no longer strapped to my back. I lost my biological family. But I took the broken, shattered pieces they threw away and cast them into a fortress of solid steel for myself. This is the hardest truth you will ever have to swallow. Family is not the people you are stuck with by an accident of birth. It is not just shared DNA or a common last name. Blood only makes you related. Family is the structure you build from the ground up, using the heavy bricks of absolute loyalty, mutual respect, and unconditional love. It is the people who stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the sky goes completely dark and the bullets start flying. If you are standing on a freezing concrete porch right now, shivering in the rain, while the people who are supposed to love you lock the deadbolt from the inside, stop knocking. Do not ever beg them to open that door. Turn your back to the porch. Walk out into the storm, bite down hard, and survive. Build your own castle. Build it so tall and so heavily armored that those toxic people will never ever be able to step foot inside. Thank you for listening to my story. If you are ready to completely redefine your own life and cut the dead weight loose, go down to the comments right now and type the words, "Keep living." Prove to yourself that you are not done fighting. And do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more raw, unfiltered truths. Stay strong, hold your ground, and I will see you in the next one.